The twins were standing so close to the edge that one more step would send them plummeting 300 feet into Raven's Gorge. Their bare feet were balanced on the crumbling limestone, toes curled over the precipice, and they were holding hands. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there in the freezing November wind, staring down into the darkness below. Reverend Thomas Caldwell saw them first. He had been traveling the mountain trail from Madison County to his new parish in Greene County when he spotted two figures in white nightgowns standing at the gorge. At first, he thought they were spirits. The morning mist was still thick, and the way they stood there, perfectly still, perfectly identical, looked like something from a nightmare. But then one of them blinked, and that is when Thomas realized they were real. They were women, and they were seconds away from death. This happened on November 7th, 1867, in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, in a remote section of the Appalachian Range where families lived days apart from each other. What Sheriff Daniel Whitmore would discover in the next 2 weeks would force him to examine every disappearance in the county for the past 100 years. What you're about to hear is the complete truth, reconstructed from Sheriff Whitmore's private journals that his great-great-granddaughter found in her attic in 1998. These journals were never meant to be read by anyone, and after you hear this story, you will understand why. And before we descend into the mountains where the Fletcher twins stood at the edge of eternity, if you are drawn to these dark corners of American history, the cases that were buried, the mysteries that were erased, the stories they did not want told, you need to subscribe to Appalachian Shadows right now. Because every week I bring you a case like this from the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Something real in spirit, something disturbing, something that challenges what you thought you knew about family bonds, human nature, and the secrets that mountains keep forever. And this one? This is one of the most haunting cases I have ever investigated, because it is not just about what happened to two young women. It is about what they were trying to prevent. The Blue Ridge Mountains in 1867 were a world unto themselves. The Civil War had ended just 2 years earlier, leaving Virginia scarred and impoverished. In the remote mountain regions, entire communities had been left to fend for themselves. There was no reliable law enforcement. The nearest town with a proper sheriff was Stanardsville, and that was a 2-day ride on horseback through treacherous mountain passes. Families like the Fletchers had lived in these mountains for generations. They were descendants of English and Scots-Irish settlers who had arrived in the 1700s, carved homesteads from the wilderness, and learned to survive in complete isolation. They hunted deer and bear. They grew what little crops the rocky soil would support. They raised children who knew how to track, how to shoot, how to survive winters that could kill you if you were not prepared. The Fletcher family lived on a property that sat in a narrow valley between two ridges, accessible only by a single winding trail that became impassable during heavy rains. The nearest neighbors, the Morrison family, lived 6 miles to the east. To the west, there was nothing but wilderness for 20 miles until you reached the next settlement. Robert Fletcher was the patriarch. He was 48 years old in 1867, a veteran of the Confederate Army who had returned home in 1865 with a limp and a silence that his wife Margaret learned not to question. Margaret Fletcher was 44, a woman who had raised 7 children in those unforgiving mountains. 5 of those children had survived to adulthood. 2 had died in infancy, as was common in that time and place. The twins, Abigail and Annabelle, were the youngest. They had been born on a freezing January night in 1848, during one of the worst blizzards the mountains had seen in decades. The midwife had not been able to reach the Fletcher homestead, so Margaret had delivered them alone, with only Robert and their oldest daughter Catherine to help. The twins came into the world within minutes of each other, Abigail first, then Annabelle. And from the very beginning, everyone who saw them agreed there was something unusual about these girls. They were identical in every visible way. Same copper red hair, same green eyes, same dusting of freckles across their noses. Even their voices sounded exactly alike. But what made people nervous was how they moved together how they seemed to communicate without speaking, how they would finish each other's sentences or know what the other was thinking before a word was said. Mountain communities in that era were deeply superstitious. Many of the old beliefs from Scotland and Ireland had survived intact, passed down through generations. Twin births were considered both a blessing and a potential curse. Some families believed twins had a special connection to the spirit world, that they could see things others could not see, know things others could not know. The Fletchers tried not to encourage such talk. They raised Abigail and Annabel like any other children. They taught them to read from the family Bible. They taught them to cook, to sew, to tend the garden, to preserve food for winter. Robert taught them to shoot, something unusual for women in that era, but necessary in the mountains where bears and wildcats were real threats. But as the twins grew older, the stories about them multiplied. Catherine Fletcher, their older sister who was 24 years old in 1867, later told investigators that she had always been unsettled by her younger sisters. Not because they were cruel or unkind. They were sweet women, gentle and helpful. But there was something in the way they looked at you sometimes, as if they were seeing through you, as if they knew things about you that you had never told anyone. There were incidents, small things that could be explained away individually, but that formed a pattern when examined together. The twins would wake up at exactly the same moment in the middle of the night, sometimes sitting up in bed simultaneously, staring at the same spot on the wall. They would speak in unison sometimes, saying the same words at the exact same time, even when they had no way of knowing what the other was about to say. And there were times when one twin would react to pain or emotion that the other was experiencing, even when they were in different rooms. In 1859, when the twins were 11 years old, something happened that changed how the family viewed them forever. Robert Fletcher had been out hunting and had fallen from a rocky outcropping, breaking his leg badly. He was 5 miles from home, unable to walk, in danger of dying from exposure or blood loss. No one at the homestead knew about the accident. No one could have known. But at the exact moment Robert fell, both twins stopped what they were doing, went completely still, and then turned to look at each other. Annabel spoke first, her voice calm but certain. "Papa is hurt, he fell. His leg is broken." Abigail nodded. "Near the red oak grove, by the big stone. He cannot walk." Margaret Fletcher did not believe them at first, but the twins were so insistent, so specific about the location, that she finally sent their older brother William to check. William found Robert exactly where the twins had described, semi-conscious from pain, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Robert survived, but the incident marked the twins as something different, something that made even their own family members uncomfortable. By the time they reached 19 years old, Abigail and Annabel had become local legends in their own right. Most young women their age in the mountains were already married, already starting families of their own. But the twins remained unmarried, not because they lacked suitors. Several young men had expressed interest over the years. But the twins always refused, gently but firmly. They had a responsibility, they would say, a duty that made marriage and children impossible, at least for now. The year 1867 brought unusual hardship to the mountains. The summer had been too dry, ruining most of the crops. The fall came early and cold. By November, families were already worrying about whether they had enough food to last until spring. And then the disappearances began. It started in late October. A young man named Samuel Hutchins, who worked as a hunter and trapper, set out from his cabin to check his trap lines and never returned. His family searched for 3 days, but found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, just his rifle, found leaning against a tree near Raven's Gorge, as if he had set it down deliberately. 2 weeks later, an elderly woman named Patience Drummond disappeared while walking to her daughter's house. The route between the two homes was less than 2 miles, a trail Patience had walked hundreds of times. She left her house in the morning and never arrived at her destination. Searchers found her shawl hanging on a tree branch near the gorge, but nothing else. Then a young married woman went missing. Elizabeth Morris, 23 years old and pregnant with her first child, vanished from her family's yard while hanging laundry. One moment she was there, the next moment she was gone. The entire community searched for 5 days, calling her name, following every trail, looking in every cave. They found her on the 5th day, standing at the edge of Raven's Gorge, staring down into the darkness, completely unresponsive. When they finally managed to pull her back from the edge, she could not speak. She just kept staring at nothing, as if her mind had gone somewhere else and had not fully returned. Elizabeth's husband brought her to the Fletcher homestead, hoping that Margaret Fletcher, who was known for her healing skills, might be able to help. Margaret tried everything she knew. She made teas from medicinal herbs. She prayed over the woman. She held cold compresses to her forehead, but nothing worked. Elizabeth remained in a state of distant silence, eating when food was put in her mouth, but never speaking, never showing any emotion. It was during this visit that the twins first showed unusual interest in the woman's condition. They stood in the doorway of the room where Elizabeth lay, holding hands, as they always did, watching her with expressions that were hard to read. Finally, Abigail spoke.
"She heard the singing," she said quietly.
Everyone in the room turned to look at her. Margaret Fletcher's expression tightened. "What singing?" she asked, her voice careful. Annabel answered this time. "The singing from the gorge. The voices that call people to the edge." She heard them, and she almost went. The room went silent. Elizabeth's husband began to shake, because even though he had not said anything to anyone, he had been thinking the same thing. There was something wrong with Raven's Gorge, something that called to people, something that wanted them to come closer, to stand at the edge, to look down into that darkness. And if the twins knew about it, that meant they had heard it too. Wait, think about this for a second. 2 19-year-old women in 1867 living in the remote mountains of Virginia, both claiming to hear voices calling people to jump off a cliff. But here is the strange part. 3 people had already gone missing near that same gorge in the past month, and a 4th had been found standing at the edge, completely unresponsive. Drop a comment right now with your theory, because this detail, it is going to matter at the end, and I want to see if anyone figures it out before we get there. Sheriff Daniel Whitmore arrived at the Fletcher homestead on November 5th, 1867. He had ridden from Stannardsville, a journey that took him almost 2 full days after receiving word about the disappearances. Whitmore was 51 years old, a former Union Army officer who had moved to Virginia after the war to take the position of sheriff. He was known for his methodical approach to investigations and his refusal to believe in superstitions. But even Whitmore had to admit that the pattern of disappearances was unusual. He had brought with him a deputy named Jacob Morrison, the son of the family that lived 6 miles east of the Fletchers, and together they planned to organize a systematic search of the area around Raven's Gorge. Margaret Fletcher met them at the door. She was a strong woman, hardened by years of mountain life, but Whitmore could see the fear in her eyes. She told him about the twins' statement, about the voices from the gorge. Whitmore listened politely, but made it clear he did not believe in such things. "Voices calling people to their death?" he said, his tone skeptical. "Mrs. Fletcher, I have seen many strange things in my life, but I have never seen anything that could not be explained by natural causes. People get lost in these mountains. They fall, they become disoriented. There is no mystery here, just tragedy." But Margaret Fletcher was not convinced. "Sheriff, my daughters have never lied to me. Not once in their lives. If they say they hear voices, then they hear something. And if that something is calling people to the gorge, then we need to find out what it is before more people die." Whitmore agreed to question the twins. He found them in the main room of the cabin, sitting side by side on a rough wooden bench, their hands clasped together as always. They looked up at him with identical green eyes, and for just a moment, Whitmore felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way they looked at him. Not fear, not curiosity. Something closer to pity. As if they knew something he did not know yet. As if they could see his future and felt sorry for what he would discover. "Miss Abigail, Miss Annabel," Whitmore said, keeping his voice respectful. "I need you to tell me about these voices. When did you first hear them?" The twins looked at each other for a long moment, communicating in that silent way they had. Finally, Abigail spoke. "We have heard them since we were young," she said. "Since we were 5 years old. They come from the Gorge. They sing, they call names. They want people to come to the edge and look down." "And have you ever gone to the edge?" Whitmore asked. "Have you ever looked down?" "Yes," Annabel said. "Many times. Because we had to. Because someone needs to watch. Someone needs to make sure the singing does not get too strong." Whitmore frowned. "What do you mean, too strong?" The twins looked at each other again. Then Abigail said something that made Whitmore's blood run cold. "Every 7th year the singing gets louder. And when it gets loud enough, people cannot resist anymore. They have to go to the edge. They have to look down. And once they look down, they see what is waiting in the darkness. And then they cannot stop themselves from falling." Whitmore felt his skepticism wavering. "And this is the 7th year?" "Yes," both twins said in unison. 1867. The 7th year since 1860. And the 7th year before that was 1853. And before that, 1846. It goes back a long time. Back to when the first people came to these mountains. Whitmore wanted to dismiss this as fantasy. But the pattern they described aligned exactly with the disappearances he had researched. He had reviewed county records going back decades, and there was indeed a pattern. Every 7 years, there was a cluster of unexplained disappearances near Raven's Gorge. Sometimes 2 people, sometimes 4 or 5, always in the fall, always near the gorge. He leaned forward, his voice urgent now. "Miss Abigail, Miss Annabel, if you know something about these disappearances, you need to tell me everything. Lives are at stake." Annabel met his eyes. "We know everything, Sheriff. We know because it is our burden to know. We are twins, and twins in these mountains have always been the ones who can hear the singing without being controlled by it. We can resist it, and our job is to stop others from going to the edge when the 7th year comes. But this year," Abigail continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, "the singing is stronger than it has ever been, stronger than our grandmother told us it would be. And we do not know if we can stop it this time." "Your grandmother?" Whitmore asked. "She was a twin too," Margaret Fletcher said from the doorway. "My mother. Catherine and Claire, they lived their whole lives in these mountains, and they told stories about the gorge, about the responsibility that twins in our family carry. I always thought they were just stories, old mountain superstitions. But now," she trailed off, looking at her daughters with an expression that mixed love and fear. Whitmore stood up. "I am going to the gorge, right now, and I want you to come with me. Both of you. If what you are saying is true, I need you to show me." The twins looked at each other, then nodded. This was what they had been trained for their entire lives. This was their purpose. The trail to Raven's Gorge wound through dense forest, following the ridgeline for nearly 3 miles before descending sharply into a narrow valley. The gorge itself was a massive split in the mountain, a 300-foot deep chasm carved by centuries of water erosion. At the bottom, a small stream still flowed, though it was nearly invisible from above, lost in the perpetual shadow of the gorge walls. Whitmore led the way, followed by Deputy Morrison and Robert Fletcher, who insisted on coming despite his still healing leg. The twins walked behind them, holding hands, their bare feet making no sound on the rocky trail. Margaret had tried to make them wear shoes, but they had refused. They said they needed to feel the earth, to stay connected to the mountain. Whitmore did not understand what that meant, but he did not argue. As they approached the gorge, Whitmore noticed something strange. The forest was completely silent. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, no wind in the trees, just absolute heavy silence that pressed against his ears like a physical weight. And then he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind, a low melodic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as they got closer to the gorge, the sound became clearer. It was singing, multiple voices, harmonizing in a language he did not recognize. The melody was beautiful and terrible at the same time. It made him want to cry and scream simultaneously. And underneath the beauty was something else. Something that pulled at him. Something that made him want to walk faster, to reach the edge, to see what was down there in the darkness. He looked back at the twins. They had stopped walking. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide. They were fighting something. He could see it in the tension of their bodies, in the way their hands gripped each other so tightly, their knuckles were white. "Sheriff," Abigail said, her voice strained. "Turn back, please. It is too strong today. If you go to the edge, you will not be able to stop yourself." But Whitmore kept walking. He was a rational man. He did not believe in curses or singing gorges or any of this mountain superstition. There had to be a natural explanation, and he was going to find it. He reached the edge of the gorge and looked down, and that is when everything he thought he knew about the world shattered into 1,000 pieces. Because there was something down there in the darkness, something that moved, something that looked up at him with eyes that glowed like embers, something that opened its mouth and sang in a voice that was not human, that had never been human, that promised everything he had ever wanted if he would just take one more step forward and fall into its embrace. Whitmore felt his foot move forward. He was going to jump. He knew it with absolute certainty. His body was no longer his own. The singing controlled him now. And then 2 hands grabbed his arm and pulled him back from the edge with surprising strength. The twins stood on either side of him, their faces determined, their voices raised in their own song. They were singing something in that same unknown language, but their version was different. It was a counter-melody, a shield against the darkness below. And as they sang, the pull on Whitmore's mind loosened. The compulsion faded. He could think clearly again. He stumbled backward, gasping, his heart pounding. Deputy Morrison and Robert Fletcher were both on the ground, hands over their ears, faces contorted in pain. They had heard it too. They had felt it too. But they had been far enough from the edge to resist. The twins kept singing, their voices growing stronger, until finally the darkness below seemed to retreat. The eyes in the gorge dimmed and disappeared. The terrible music faded to silence, and the forest around them suddenly erupted with sound again. Birds calling, wind rustling through leaves, the normal, beautiful sounds of life. Abigail and Annabel stopped singing. They swayed on their feet, exhausted. Whitmore caught them both before they could fall. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "What in God's name was that?" Annabel looked up at him, her green eyes filled with ancient knowledge that no 19-year-old should possess. "That," she said quietly, "is what we have been protecting people from our whole lives. That is why twins exist in these mountains. That is our purpose." And in that moment, Sheriff Daniel Whitmore understood that this investigation was not going to end the way any of his previous cases had ended. This was not about finding a killer or solving a mystery. This was about something that existed outside the boundaries of law and reason. Something that had been waiting in Raven's Gorge for longer than anyone could remember. Something that wanted to consume them all. They made it back to the Fletcher homestead in silence. No one wanted to speak about what they had seen and heard at the gorge. How could they put words to something like that? How could they explain to anyone else that there was something living in the darkness 300 feet below the surface of the earth? Something that sang in a voice that could control human minds. Something that wanted them to jump. Sheriff Whitmore sat at the Fletcher family's rough wooden table, his hands still shaking as he accepted a cup of hot tea from Margaret. His deputy, Jacob Morrison, was pale and quiet, staring at nothing. Robert Fletcher stood by the fire, leaning heavily on his walking stick, his expression grim. The twins sat together on their bench, hands clasped as always. They looked exhausted, dark circles under their eyes, their copper hair disheveled. But they were calm. They had done this before, many times before. Margaret Fletcher broke the silence. "My mother told me stories when I was a girl," she said quietly. "Stories about the gorge, about what lived there. I thought they were just tales to frighten children, ways to keep us from wandering too close to dangerous places." "Tell me," Whitmore said. His voice was hoarse. "Tell me everything your mother told you." Margaret sat down across from him. "The story goes back to before the white settlers came to these mountains. The Cherokee who lived here first knew about the gorge. They called it the mouth of the hungry stone. They said that something ancient lived inside the mountain, something that fed on life, on consciousness, on the essence of human beings. And every 7 years, when the barrier between worlds grew thin, it would wake up and call to people, try to lure them to their deaths. Whitmore wanted to dismiss this as folklore, but he had seen those eyes in the darkness. He had felt that pull. He knew with absolute certainty that what Margaret was describing was real. The Cherokee made a pact, Margaret continued. They would give the thing in the gorge what it needed. Not human sacrifices, but offerings of another kind, songs, rituals, ways to keep it satisfied without feeding its souls. And in exchange, it would sleep. It would not call so loudly. It would not take people. But then the settlers came, Robert Fletcher said from his position by the fire, and the Cherokee were driven out or killed, and the pact was broken. The thing in the gorge started waking up fully every 7 years, started calling to anyone who came close, started collecting souls again. And that is when the twins started being born, Annabelle said softly. The mountain needed protectors, guardians who could hear the singing but not be controlled by it. So it changed some of the families who lived here. It gave them daughters, always 2 at a time, always with the ability to resist. Abigail picked up the story. Our grandmother and her twin sister were the guardians in their generation. They taught our mother everything, but our mother was not a twin, so she could not hear the singing. She could only pass down the knowledge. And when we were born, she knew what we were, what we would have to do. Whitmore leaned forward. How many others have there been? How many generations of twins protecting this place? The twins looked at each other, their silent communication passing between them. 7 generations, they said in unison. Going back to 1763, that was when the first guardians were born, Catherine and Claire Patterson. They were the daughters of an English settler and a Cherokee woman. The mountain chose them, made them what we are. Made you what? Morrison asked, speaking for the first time since they had returned. What are you? Annabelle met his eyes. We are the Watchers. We can hear the song without being taken by it. We can sing back to the darkness and push it down. We can stand at the edge and not fall. That is our gift and our curse. Whitmore thought about this for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been forming in his mind since they left the gorge. The people who disappeared, Samuel Hutchins, Patience Drummond, the others, did they fall or were they taken? Both, Abigail said. They heard the singing. They went to the edge, and when they looked down, they saw what we saw today. But they had no protection, no resistance, so they fell. And when they hit the bottom, she paused, her expression haunted. They do not die right away. The thing down there keeps them alive for a while, feeds on them slowly. Their fear, their pain, their life force, until there is nothing left but bones. The room went silent. Margaret Fletcher made a small sound of distress. Whitmore felt sick. How do you know this? He asked quietly. Because we have seen it, Annabelle said. We have to go down into the gorge sometimes, to check, to see how many it has taken, to make sure the bones are laid to rest properly. That is part of our duty, the dark parts that no one wants to know about. Whitmore stood up abruptly. Then we're going down there tomorrow. We're going to find those people, bring them back, and give them proper burials. And we are going to figure out how to stop this thing permanently. But the twins shook their heads in unison. You cannot stop it, Sheriff, Abigail said. It is part of the mountain. It has been here for thousands of years. It will be here for thousands more. The only thing you can do is maintain the balance. Keep people away during the 7th years. Let the Watchers do their work. No, Whitmore said firmly. I do not accept that. There has to be a way. There has to be something we can do. The twins looked at him with those knowing eyes again, that expression of pity, of foreknowledge. And Whitmore realized with a sinking feeling that they knew something about what was coming, something they were not telling him yet. But before he could press them further, there was a knock at the door, a frantic, desperate knock. Robert Fletcher opened it to find a man from the Morrison family, breathless from running, his face white with terror. Sheriff, the man gasped. You need to come quickly. It is happening again. 3 people left their homes an hour ago, all of them walking toward the gorge. All of them with that same empty look in their eyes. If we do not stop them, they are going to jump. That night marked the beginning of what the Fletcher family would later call the 7 days of darkness. It was the peak of the 7th-year cycle, the time when the thing in Raven's Gorge was at its strongest, when the singing reached its maximum power and people for miles around could hear it if they listened carefully. Sheriff Whitmore and his deputy, along with Robert Fletcher and 6 other men from nearby homesteads, organized a watch system. They would patrol the trails leading to the gorge, intercept anyone walking toward it in that empty, compelled state, and bring them back to safety. The twins insisted on being part of the patrols. Whitmore was reluctant at first, but Margaret finally convinced him that they were necessary. Only the twins could get close enough to the gorge to pull people back from the edge. Only they had the resistance and the counter-song that could break the compulsion. And if this investigation is drawing you in so far, tap that like button. It genuinely helps Appalachian Shadows bring more of these forgotten cases to light. These stories from the mountains deserve to be told. The first person they intercepted was Thomas Brennan, a farmer who lived 8 miles to the north. They found him at midnight, walking barefoot down the trail in his nightshirt, his eyes open but unseeing. Whitmore tried to stop him, but Brennan pushed past him with surprising strength, desperate to reach the gorge. It took both twins singing their counter-melody for 5 full minutes before Brennan finally stopped, blinked, and looked around in confusion. He had no memory of leaving his house, no memory of the compulsion. The last thing he remembered was going to sleep in his bed. They took him back to his family and posted a guard at his house for the rest of the night. But they knew they could not guard everyone. Not in a region where families lived miles apart, where there were hundreds of trails and paths through the mountains. The second person they lost, her name was Emily Thornton. She was 19 years old, engaged to be married to a young man from Stannardsville. She slipped out of her parents' house at 3 in the morning while they were sleeping, and by the time they realized she was gone and sent for help, it was too late. Whitmore and the twins found her at dawn, standing at the edge of Raven's Gorge, her toes over the precipice, swaying slightly in the morning breeze. The twins tried to reach her, tried to sing their protective song, but the compulsion was too strong. Emily was too far gone. She smiled at something in the darkness below, a beautiful, peaceful smile. And then she stepped forward and fell. Whitmore would never forget the sound she made. Not a scream of terror, but a laugh, a sound of joy and relief, as if she was finally going home after a long journey. The twins collapsed after that, overwhelmed by their failure. Abigail was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. Annabelle held her sister, rocking back and forth, whispering words of comfort in that unknown language they sometimes used. "We were too late," Abigail said when she could finally speak. "We should have been here earlier. We should have felt her coming." "You cannot save everyone," Whitmore said gently. But the words felt hollow. He had promised Emily's parents he would find their daughter, and now he would have to tell them she was dead, that she had jumped into a gorge, that there was nothing left to bury. By the 3rd day, the pattern became clearer. The singing was strongest between midnight and dawn. That was when the compulsion hit people hardest. That was when they left their homes and walked toward the gorge. But there was another pattern too. The people who were most susceptible were those who were unhappy, those who carried grief or pain or despair. Samuel Hutchins, the first to disappear, had lost his wife in childbirth 6 months earlier. Patience Drummond had been a widow for 3 years, living alone, increasingly isolated from her family. Emily Thornton, despite her engagement, had been struggling with melancholy for months, a sadness she could not explain or shake. The thing in the gorge was not just calling randomly. It was targeting the vulnerable, those whose defenses were already weakened by suffering. Whitmore realized with growing horror that this made a terrible kind of sense. If the thing fed on life force, on consciousness, then it would naturally seek out the people whose hold on life was already fragile. The people who might, on some level, want to let go. On the 4th night, they saved 2 people, but they lost one. On the 5th night, they saved 4 and lost none. The twins were getting better at sensing who was being called. They could feel the pull of the compulsion from a distance, track it like hounds following a scent. But the effort was destroying them. Each time they sang the counter melody, each time they pushed back against the darkness, it took something from them. They were growing paler, thinner, their eyes hollow with exhaustion. Margaret begged them to rest, but they refused. "If we stop now," Annabel said, "more people will die. We can rest when the 7 days are over, when the singing fades again." On the 6th night, Whitmore asked the twins the question that had been bothering him since the beginning. "How did you know I would be at the Gorge that morning? When Reverend Caldwell found you?" The twins looked at each other. That silent communication. And then Abigail spoke. "We went there to die, Sheriff. We were going to jump together. That morning, when Reverend Caldwell found us, we were saying goodbye to the world." Whitmore felt his blood run cold.
"What? Why?"
"Because we thought it might end the cycle," Annabel said. "We thought that if the Guardians died, if there were no more Watchers, the mountain might have to find another way, a better way. We were tired of this burden, tired of knowing that every 7 years we would have to watch people die, tired of carrying responsibility we never asked for." "But you did not jump," Whitmore said. "No," Abigail said, "because at the last moment we realized something. If we died, there would be no one to stop the singing, no one to save the people who would be called during these 7 days. Our death would not end anything. It would only make it worse. We would be abandoning everyone who depends on us." "So we stepped back from the edge," Annabel continued. "And then Reverend Caldwell arrived. And then you came, and we knew that this year would be different, that maybe finally someone would believe us. Someone would help us carry this burden." Whitmore reached out and took both their hands. "I believe you," he said, "and I will help you, whatever it takes. Be honest with me in the comments. If you were in the twins' position, would you have continued to carry that burden? Or would you have jumped, hoping someone else would figure out a solution? Because I have thought about this a lot while researching this case, and I am still not sure there was a right answer. The 7th day arrived with clear skies and cold wind. The twins said this would be the peak, the moment when the thing in the gorge would make its final, strongest attempt to feed. If they could survive this day, if they could keep people away from the edge until midnight, the cycle would end. The singing would fade back to a whisper for another 7 years. But there was a problem. More and more people were feeling the call. Even those who had never been susceptible before were reporting strange dreams, hearing faint music on the wind, feeling an inexplicable urge to walk toward the gorge. The compulsion was spreading, like a disease, like a contagion. By noon, Whitmore realized they could not protect everyone. There were not enough men, not enough hours in the day. The thing in the gorge was adapting, learning, growing stronger with each soul it consumed. It was no longer content to wait for people to come to it. It was reaching out actively, pulling them toward their deaths. And then the twins made a decision that changed everything. "We are going down," Abigail said. "Down where?" Whitmore asked, though he already knew the answer. "Into the gorge," Annabel said. "To the bottom. To face it directly. It is the only way to stop this." "Absolutely not," Whitmore said firmly. "I will not let you descend into that place. It is suicide." But the twins shook their heads. "We are the only ones who can survive it, Sheriff. We are the Watchers. We have the protection our ancestors gave us. And we know the songs, the old songs, the ones that can bind it, push it back down into its deepest sleep." "Your grandmother did this," Margaret said quietly. She had been listening from the doorway. "My mother and her sister. During their 7th-year cycle, when they were young women, they went down into the gorge. They sang the binding songs, and they came back, barely. They were never the same afterward, but they came back." Whitmore looked at the twins, and these two 19-year-old women who carried a responsibility that should never have been theirs, who had lived their entire lives knowing they were different, knowing they had a duty that could kill them. "How do we get you down there?" he asked finally, because he knew with certainty that he could not stop them. This was their choice, their burden, their purpose. "There is a trail," Abigail said, "a hidden path that winds down the gorge wall. Our grandmother showed it to our mother before she died, and our mother showed it to us. Only the watchers know it exists. They gathered supplies, ropes, lanterns, food and water. Whitmore and Deputy Morrison insisted on going with them. Robert Fletcher wanted to come too, but his leg was still too weak for the dangerous descent. At sunset on the 7th day, the group stood at the edge of Raven's Gorge. The singing was so loud now that even Whitmore could hear it clearly. It was beautiful and terrible. It promised peace and belonging and an end to all suffering. It promised everything a human heart could desire. The twins took the lead. They found a narrow crack in the rock face, barely visible among the stones and brush. And then they began to descend into the darkness. The trail was treacherous. It switched back down the gorge wall, sometimes so narrow they had to press their backs against the stone and edge along sideways. There were places where the path had crumbled away, forcing them to climb down sheer rock faces using whatever handholds they could find. The singing grew louder with every step. The darkness grew thicker. The air became colder and damper, carrying scents of earth and decay and something else, something old, something that had been alive when these mountains were young. They descended for what felt like hours. Whitmore lost all sense of time. The only light came from their lanterns, small circles of illumination in an ocean of darkness. And below them, far below, they could see a faint glow, red and pulsing, like the embers of a dying fire, like eyes watching them descend. Finally, after what Whitmore's watch told him was 3 hours but felt like 3 days, they reached the bottom of the gorge. The small stream trickled past their feet, its water black and cold. The walls of the gorge rose up on either side, 300 feet of stone blocking out the sky. And there, in the darkness at the far end of the gorge, was something that should not exist. It was not a creature in any traditional sense. It was not animal or human or anything Whitmore had words to describe. It was a presence, a darkness that moved and breathed and watched, a thing made of hunger and ancient hate and patient eternal waiting. And when it spoke with the voices of everyone it had ever consumed. Hundreds of voices, thousands, all blended together into one terrible chorus. The Watchers come at last, it said. The little singers, the inheritors of the broken pact. You cannot bind me forever, daughters of the mountain. Eventually your line will fail, and I will be free to feed as I once did, as I was meant to do. The twins stood together, holding hands, facing the darkness. They were terrified. Whitmore could see them shaking, but they did not run. They did not falter. Instead, they began to sing, and this time their song was different than anything Whitmore had heard before. It was not just a counter melody. It was a command, a binding, a sealing. They sang in that unknown language, their voices rising and falling in complex harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere beyond them, from their ancestors, from the mountain itself. The darkness recoiled. It fought back, its own song rising to drown out the twins. The air itself seemed to tear. Whitmore felt something inside him start to break, as if his mind could not contain the reality of what he was witnessing. But the twins did not stop. They sang and sang, their voices growing stronger even as their bodies grew weaker. Abigail's nose began to bleed. Annabelle swayed on her feet. But they kept singing, and slowly, impossibly, the darkness began to retreat. It pulled back into the deepest shadows at the far end of the gorge. Its red eyes dimmed, its voices faded, until finally there was silence. The twins collapsed into Whitmore's arms. They were barely conscious, bleeding from their noses and ears, their skin cold and pale. But they were alive, and they had done it. They had pushed the thing back down into whatever pit it came from. They had bought another 7 years of relative peace. "We need to get them out of here," Morrison said urgently. Now, the climb back up was even worse than the descent. The twins could barely walk. Whitmore and Morrison had to carry them for large stretches of the trail. Several times, Whitmore thought they would not make it, thought the rock would crumble beneath them or the darkness below would reach up and pull them back down. But as the first light of dawn began to filter into the gorge, they finally reached the top. They collapsed on solid ground, gasping, exhausted beyond measure. The 7th day had passed. The cycle was complete. The singing was gone, faded back to a whisper that only the most sensitive could hear. But the cost had been terrible, and Whitmore knew, looking at the twins' exhausted faces, that they would have to do this again in 7 years. And 7 years after that, and 7 years after that, until their line finally ended, or they found another way. And somewhere in the darkness, 300 feet below, something ancient and patient settled back into its long sleep, counting the days until it could wake again and sing its song of hunger and death. The twins slept for 2 full days. Margaret Fletcher kept constant watch over them, changing cold compresses on their foreheads, forcing small sips of water and broth between their lips when they would take it. Dr. Harrison Caldwell, Reverend Caldwell's brother, rode up from Stanardsville to examine them and pronounced that they were suffering from extreme exhaustion and something he could not quite name. Something that had depleted them on a level deeper than physical fatigue. Sheriff Whitmore stayed at the Fletcher homestead during those 2 days. He could not bring himself to leave, not yet. Not until he knew the twins would survive. He spent the time writing in his journal, documenting everything that had happened, knowing even as he wrote that no one would believe him. That this account would have to remain secret, locked away, hidden from a world that was not ready to accept such truths. On the 3rd day, the twins woke. They were weak and pale, but alive. And the first thing Abigail asked was whether anyone else had died during the 7th day. No, Whitmore told her gently. You saved them all. Every single person who was called that night, they all survived. Because of what you did. The twins looked at each other with relief and something that might have been pride. They had fulfilled their duty. They had kept the balance, at least for now. As the twins recovered over the next week, Whitmore began his investigation into the history of the disappearances. He rode to the county seat and spent days in the records office, pulling every document related to unexplained deaths and disappearances in the region around Raven's Gorge. What he found confirmed everything the twins had told him. Going back to 1763, there were clusters of disappearances every 7 years, sometimes 2 people, sometimes 5 or 6, always in the fall, always near the gorge. The records were incomplete. Many documents had been lost or destroyed over the decades, but the pattern was undeniable. He also found references to twins, births of twin girls in families that lived near the gorge. And often those twin births occurred in the years following particularly bad cycles, as if the mountain itself was responding to the need for new guardians. Catherine and Claire Patterson, born in 1763, the first watchers. They were 19 years old during their first binding ritual in 1782. Rebecca and Rachel Morrison, born in 1790. They performed their first binding at age 19 in 1809. Sarah and Susan Fletcher, born in 1824, Margaret's mother. They were 19 during their binding ritual in 1843. And now Abigail and Annabel, born in 1848. 19 years old when they descended into the gorge in 1867. 4 generations of twins, all coming of age at 19 to face their destiny. All born in families that lived within a few miles of Raven's Gorge, all carrying the same burden. All knowing from childhood that they would have to face the darkness when their time came. Whitmore also discovered something else. A sealed court order from 1798, signed by a judge whose name had been blacked out. The order declared that all information regarding certain events at Raven's Gorge was to be suppressed. That anyone who spoke publicly about the disappearances would face charges of disturbing the peace and inciting panic. Someone in authority 70 years ago had known about the thing in the gorge, and they had decided that the best course of action was silence, secrecy, letting the watchers handle the problem quietly without public knowledge or intervention. It was a conspiracy of silence that had lasted for decades, and Whitmore understood reluctantly that he was about to become part of it. Because what was the alternative? Tell people the truth! Cause panic? Force families to evacuate an entire region because of something that sounded like a fairy tale. No, the twins were right. The only solution was to maintain the balance. Keep people away from the gorge during the dangerous times. Let the watchers do their work, and hope that someday someone would find a better answer. But there was one more thing Whitmore needed to know, one more piece of the puzzle that had been bothering him since that night in the gorge. When the twins were strong enough, he asked them about the voices. The thing in the darkness had spoken with hundreds of voices, thousands maybe. The voices of everyone it had consumed over the centuries. Are they still alive down there? He asked quietly. The people who fell, are their souls trapped somehow? The twins looked at each other, that silent communication. Finally, Annabelle spoke. We do not know, she said honestly. Our grandmother believed that the thing consumes the life force, but leaves something behind. A fragment, an echo. Maybe that is what we heard. The echoes of everyone it has taken. Can they be freed? Whitmore asked. Can those souls be released? Abigail shook her head slowly. Not without destroying the thing completely. And we do not know how to do that. The binding songs can push it into sleep, but they cannot kill it. It is part of the mountain, part of the earth itself. It has been here since long before humans arrived, and it will be here long after we are gone. Whitmore felt a deep sadness settle over him. All those people. Samuel Hutchins, Patience Drummond, Emily Thornton, dozens more throughout the decades. Their lives ended, their souls trapped or consumed, and there was nothing anyone could do to save them. What about the bones, he asked, at the bottom of the gorge? Should we recover them? Give them proper burials? The twins considered this. Yes, they said in unison. That would be good. They deserve to rest in consecrated ground, to be remembered and mourned. So Whitmore organized one more expedition. This time in daylight, during a period when the singing was at its weakest. A team of 6 men descended into the gorge and spent 2 days recovering remains. They found 17 skulls, dozens of other bones scattered throughout the gorge floor. Personal effects, clothing fragments, small items that told stories of the people who had died there. They brought everything back to the surface and buried it in a plot of land donated by Robert Fletcher. A simple stone marker was erected with the names of those who could be identified and a line for those who could not. Here rest the souls claimed by the mountain. May they find peace at last. The families of the victims were told their loved ones had fallen accidentally, that the gorge was dangerous and people should stay away from it. Most accepted this explanation. A few suspected there was more to the story, but they did not press for details. Mountain communities had long traditions of not asking too many questions about certain things. As fall turned to winter, life slowly returned to normal in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The disappearances stopped. The singing faded to silence. People went back to their daily struggles of survival in that harsh landscape. But things had changed for the Fletcher family. The twins were no longer just Margaret and Robert's youngest daughters. They were known now, recognized. People spoke of them in hushed, respectful tones. The women who had saved lives. The women who had faced something terrible and survived. Some families brought gifts to the Fletcher homestead, offerings of gratitude for what the twins had done. Others stayed away, made uncomfortable by what the twins represented, by the knowledge that something ancient and hungry lived beneath the mountains where they had built their homes. The twins handled it all with quiet dignity. They went back to their normal lives as much as possible, helping with chores, tending the garden, learning the skills they would need to survive as adult women in that harsh environment. But they were different now, changed by what they had experienced, marked by the burden they carried. Whitmore visited the Fletcher homestead one more time before winter made the trails impassable. He brought copies of all the documents he had found, sealed them in an oilcloth package, and gave them to Margaret Fletcher. Keep these safe, he told her. Someday someone may need to know the truth. Your daughter's daughters, the next generation of watchers. They should know the full history, everything that came before them. Margaret promised to guard the documents carefully. And then she asked Whitmore a question that had been troubling her. Do you think it will ever end, Sheriff? This cycle, or will there always be watchers needed in these mountains? Whitmore did not have a good answer. I hope it ends, he said finally. I hope someday we find a way to destroy the thing in the gorge permanently. But until then, your daughters are heroes. They saved lives. They kept the darkness at bay. That is not a small thing. Before he left, Whitmore spoke with the twins one last time. They stood together on the porch of the homestead, wrapped in shawls against the cold wind, their copper hair bright in the winter sunlight. "Will you be all right?" he asked them, "knowing you will have to do this again in 7 years?" Abigail and Annabel looked at each other. Then they looked back at Whitmore with those ancient, knowing eyes. "We will do what we have always done," Annabel said. "We will watch. We will listen. We will be ready when the singing grows loud again. And maybe," Abigail added, "someday we will find the answers our grandmother could not find. The way to truly end this, to free the mountain from whatever curse or pact created this situation. We have 7 years to search, to learn, to prepare." Whitmore nodded. He wanted to believe them, wanted to think that these 2 remarkable women might find a solution that had eluded 4 generations of watchers before them. But deep down, he suspected the truth, that this cycle was older than anyone knew, that it was woven into the very fabric of the mountains, and that as long as these peaks stood, as long as the gorge split the earth, there would need to be watchers standing guard against the darkness below. The story of Abigail and Annabel Fletcher spread through the mountain communities over the following years, though always in whispers, always in carefully guarded conversations. Their names became part of local folklore. The twin women who saved people from the gorge, the guardians of the mountain. In 1874, 7 years after the events of this story, the singing returned. And once again, the twins descended into Raven's Gorge to perform the binding ritual. This time they knew what to expect. They were stronger, more prepared, but the cost was still terrible. Abigail lost her hearing in her left ear. Annabel developed a tremor in her hands that would stay with her for the rest of her life. They performed the ritual again in 1881, and again in 1888. Each time they bound the darkness. Each time they paid a price. In 1892, something changed. Abigail met a man from the Morrison family, fell in love, and married. Annabel was hesitant at first, worried about being separated from her twin after spending their entire lives together. But then she met his brother, and she married him too. The twins raised their families on neighboring properties, their houses within shouting distance of each other, never separated for more than a day at a time. And in 1895, both twins gave birth. Abigail had twin daughters. Annabel had twin daughters, 4 girls total, born within weeks of each other. The next generation of watchers had arrived. They would be 19 years old in 1914, ready to face their first binding ritual. The pattern continued, the cycle perpetuated. Generation after generation of twins born to guard Raven's Gorge. Some lived long lives. Others died young, worn down by the burden they carried. But there were always watchers, always someone standing between the darkness and the people who lived in its shadow. Sheriff Daniel Whitmore never spoke publicly about what happened in November of 1867. He kept his promise of silence, but he wrote everything down in his private journals, documenting the truth for anyone who might find it years or decades or centuries later. In his final entry, written in 1893 as he lay dying of pneumonia, Whitmore reflected on the case that had changed his understanding of reality. "I have spent my career pursuing truth and justice," he wrote in a shaking hand. "I believed that the law could solve all problems. That reason could explain all mysteries. But Raven's Gorge taught me different. It taught me that there are things in this world older than law, deeper than reason. Things that cannot be arrested or tried or sentenced. Things that can only be contained by sacrifice and courage and the willingness of a few to bear burdens the many never have to know exist." The Fletcher twins were heroes in the truest sense, not because they fought battles or won wars, but because they stood watch in the darkness year after year, because they gave up the chance for normal lives to protect people who would never know or understand what was done for them. I pray that someday the cycle will end, that the thing in the gorge will be destroyed or released or transformed into something that does not feed on human souls. But until that day comes, I am grateful for the watchers, for the twins who guard the darkness, For the women who sing binding songs and pay terrible prices so that others can live in ignorance and peace. If you are reading this, whoever you are, whatever year it is, know this. The Fletchers saved my life. They saved dozens of lives. And they will continue to save lives long after I am dust. Remember them, honor them, and pray you never have to face what they faced in the darkness at the bottom of Raven's Gorge. The journals were sealed and stored away by Whitmore's family. For over 100 years, they remained hidden. And during that time, the Watchers continued their work in silence. But in 1998, Daniel Whitmore's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Elizabeth Monroe, was sorting through boxes of family documents she had inherited, and she found the journals. She read them late into the night, unable to stop, horrified and fascinated by what her ancestor had documented. And when she finished, she faced a choice: destroy the journals and let the secret die with her, or preserve them and allow the truth to be known. She chose preservation. She donated the journals to the Virginia Historical Society with instructions that they remain sealed for another 20 years until 2018. And when that year arrived, the journals were finally open to researchers. That is how I learned this story. That is how the truth about Abigail and Annabelle Fletcher finally came to light after 150 years of silence. I traveled to the Blue Ridge Mountains. I visited the site of the old Fletcher homestead, now long abandoned, reclaimed by forest. I found Raven's Gorge still as deep and dark and forbidding as it was in 1867. And I stood at its edge listening. And I swear to you, if you listen carefully, you can still hear it, faint, distant, but there. A melody carried on the wind, a song that promises everything and costs everything. The same song that has been singing from that darkness for thousands of years. Are there still watchers? Are there still twins standing guard against the darkness? I do not know for certain. The families who lived near the gorge have mostly left over the decades. The area is sparsely populated now, but the local people, the ones who have lived in these mountains for generations, they still tell stories. Still warn their children to stay away from certain places, still speak in whispers about things that should not be spoken of aloud. The official records of what happened in November 1867 were sealed by court order and destroyed in a fire in 1896. Whether that fire was accidental or deliberate, no one knows. But the suppression was complete. Until the discovery of Whitmore's journals, there was no documentation that any of this had ever happened. And yet the disappearances continue, not every 7 years anymore. The pattern has become less regular, but people still vanish near Raven's Gorge, still are found standing at its edge, staring into the darkness, still jump sometimes for reasons their families can never understand. The Forest Service has posted warning signs now. The gorge is officially off limits. Too dangerous, they say. Too many accidents. But the signs do not stop everyone. Hikers still venture too close. Curious tourists still peer over the edge. And some of them never come back. This is the story of Abigail and Annabelle Fletcher, twin sisters born in 1848 in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. Women who lived extraordinary lives while appearing perfectly ordinary. Women who faced ancient horrors and survived. Guardians who stood watch in the darkness so others could live in the light. They died within hours of each other in 1931. Both were 83 years old. The official cause of death was heart failure, but their families knew the truth. They had performed the binding ritual one final time in 1929 at the age of 81, and the cost had been too great. They had given everything they had left to keep the darkness at bay for one more cycle. They were buried side by side in the family cemetery, their graves marked with simple stones that bear only their names and dates. No mention of what they did, no record of what they sacrificed. Just 2 names among dozens in a small mountain graveyard that few people ever visit. But if you go there, if you stand between their graves and listen carefully, you might hear something. A faint echo of the song they sang, the binding melody that held back the darkness, the counter song that saved so many lives. And if you are very unlucky, you might hear the other song too. The one that calls from the depths, the hunger that never dies, the darkness that waits patiently for its next meal. Some mysteries, I have learned, are not meant to be solved. Some questions should not be answered. Some secrets exist because the truth would be too terrible to bear. But some stories deserve to be told anyway, not to satisfy curiosity or provide closure, but to honor the people who lived them, to remember the sacrifices that were made, to acknowledge that there are those who stand watch in the darkness while the rest of us sleep peacefully, never knowing how close the danger really is. This was the story of the Fletcher twins, a reminder that heroism does not always wear uniforms or win medals. Sometimes it looks like two young women holding hands at the edge of a gorge. Sometimes it sounds like a song sung in an unknown language. Sometimes it costs everything and receives no recognition. But it matters, it saves lives, and it deserves to be remembered. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person Appalachian Shadows exists for. Someone who does not turn away from the darkness. Someone who wants to understand the truth buried in these mountains, no matter how disturbing. Next week, I'm bringing you the story of the Blackwater 13. In March of 1904, 13 coal miners descended into a newly opened shaft in McDowell County, West Virginia. Only one came back up. And what he described happening in those depths made the mine company seal the entrance with concrete and dynamite. No investigation, no recovery of the bodies. Just silence and suppression for over 100 years. In that case, it makes this one look tame. Subscribe to Appalachian Shadows now and turn on notifications, because these stories from the hollows and ridges do not stay buried forever. One more thing. I know many of you watching are from Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, the Carolinas, Appalachian country. If your family has stories like this, cases that were hushed up, disappearances that were never solved, secrets that were buried in the hollows, share them in the comments. You do not have to use names, just the story, because I read every single comment. And your stories might become the next investigation here on Appalachian Shadows.